welcome to the second episode of our Epic X-Men reread. This is the second of 7 weeks that we're going to pilot this idea of leaping around through different parts of the X-Men's first 50 years of comic book history to read some selected arcs. Some of them are classics, some of them have to do with current media that's being released, some of them are just random picks. Up today are the New Mutants 1983 series, issues 26, 27, and 28. And you might be asking yourself, why are we jumping into New Mutants in the middle of its third year of publication? Shouldn't we just start with issue number 1 or its graphic novel? Well, we're jumping in here because these issues are a pretty specific, famous story, and that is the origin of Legion, David Haller, who is Professor X's son, but he's also the star of FX's Legion television series. It's one of my favorite comic book media series. I love it, and it's about to enter its second season, so I thought what better time to read about Legion's humble beginnings here in New Mutants. Now, if you want these books in your collection, there are only really two main ways that they're collected. They're in the New Mutants classic line, but that's been long out of print and they're getting kind of hard to find. And they're also in a new book that's basically like a Legion greatest hits book. It's called X-Men Legion Shadow King Rising, and it has the 3 original Legion stories. This story, one from the 350s of Uncanny X-Men, and then the Muir Island saga, which pretty heavily features Legion under the control of the Shadow King, which definitely has some things that are similar to the plot of the television series. So you can continue and read all of the stuff in that book if you want to keep getting ready for the series. We're just going to read this one intro plot and then leap to something else next week. As we arrive in this story, we're arriving along with the physical arrival of a number of characters. Professor X has been summoned by Moira McTaggart, a former lover and a frequent lab partner and scientific co-conspirator, to Muir Island, her scientific research base, because of a particular patient she has there. We see in the opening scenes of issue 26 that this patient has put a stunning psychic bolt out to knock out these 2 characters. And when Professor X arrives, he finds them in a relative blank slate. He compares it to the state that Rogue leaves characters in. Now, Professor Xavier does not arrive alone. He arrives with some of the New Mutants in tow. The New Mutants is a team of a third genesis of mutant characters that he puts together while the X-Men are in space in the 160s of Uncanny X-Men with the Brood, and he assumes they're dead, and so he collects the next generation of mutants. Now, this is not the full team. It's actually a pretty small splinter of them. It includes Danny Moonstar, who is their ostensible leader, Mirage, Rain Sinclair, whose nickname is Wolfsbane, Doug Ramsey, Cypher, and Warlock, who is this brand new character that they've just met in the last few issues. He's a techno-organic life form from the depths of space who's come to Earth, and he's kind of a mutant of his own race because he's not as violent and domineering as the rest of his techno-organic race. And so the New Mutants have sort of adopted him kind of as a friend, a little bit as a pet. It's a strange relationship. Professor X says, let me investigate what's going on with Legion here. And the rest of the team kind of goes off and has a day off. And in this day off, we get a lot of little bits of business with them that don't really get followed up on in this particular arc, although they're very interesting bits of business. I want to dig into 2 of them that happen relatively early on. One of them is that they're on the docks, having come from the island to the mainland, and Rain Sinclair, it's her hometown. She grew up with Moira McTaggart as sort of her mother figure, and she encounters this fundamentalist religious figure who had raised her before she was under Dr. McTaggart's care. And he kind of just is like, oh, Hellspawn, what are you doing here? But it's one of these themes where Claremont has taken this hated and feared thing and made it quite specific, right? It's not just this general hated and feared of mutants. Rain, as Wolfsbane, is a lot more like Nightcrawler than like Storm or like Cyclops, in that she turns into a totally other thing when her powers are activated, and it's seen as something hellish, something that's against religion, something that should be kept in chains and reviled. And this is some of the mutant metaphor at its most powerful, because we know that in our world, there are people that are being discriminated against in the name of religion in the same way, in the name of many different religions in the same way. And Claremont makes it pretty clear here, and that plot gets picked up multiple times with Rain over the years. It's really one of the prevailing plots of her character, and it hurts all the more here because she's such a young innocent character. She's really portrayed the youngest out of all of the X-Men characters we've met. Even though Kitty is maybe around the same age as her, Kitty just has a more of a mental toughness than Reign, who's this very young, good-natured kid who's been through hell at the hands of this preacher. So that's a really interesting moment. And then the other interesting moment I maybe read a little bit more into than was there, but I couldn't help it. So there's this moment on the docks where Warlock, to absorb nutrients, he's got to infect biological creatures with his techno-organic virus, and he unwittingly does it to a bird. And the team's like, no, 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 you can't just infect things and randomly eat them, although I think of all things he could have eaten, the bird was probably okay. And Danny, in this exchange, briefly grabs his arm, or he grabs her arm, and she kind of recoils in shock and thinks, oh my gosh, am I infected now? Did I get the virus? Am I going to turn into a techno-organic organism? I couldn't help but think of a parallel with this issue coming out in 1985 to AIDS HIV. This had been a developing story in the United States all throughout the early 80s, and it came to its first really massive public groundswell a little bit after this issue, because there was a child named Ryan White. He was a teenager, and he was a hemophiliac, and he needed a blood transfusion. And at the time, blood transfusions were not screened for HIV/AIDS, and so he winds up contracting HIV through the transfusion. And when his school finds out, which is happening right around the time this issue comes out, so it hadn't hit the news yet, there's a great outcry from the school and the community, and they decide it would be better if he's not in the school. Now, we know now, and we knew then, although not as widely known by general members of the populace, that AIDS/HIV cannot be transmitted through touch, through sneezing, through saliva. It's bloodborne and carried by other bodily fluids other than saliva, other than tears. But this kind of, it exposed how much the people that were suffering with this disease had been ostracized. And to that point, it had very much been homosexual people, gay people. The original name for the disease was GRID, which had the word gay in it, which was changed by the CDC. And this was a time that it got very humanized because, much like with the discrimination against Reign in this issue, it was humanized because it was a child. Now, that brings up other questions, right? Like, shouldn't we be able to see the humanity in everybody? Shouldn't we feel bad as a public about anybody who's being discriminated against or anybody who's afflicted with anything? But, you know, it becomes easier when you see that in the perceived eyes of an innocent, whether that's for better or for worse. And I just couldn't help but think of the parallel of what was happening with that at the time and, you know, the situation with Reign and then this moment with Danny. It just all seemed connected to me. Whether or not Claremont actually was thinking of that at all, who knows? Because, you know, it was definitely in the zeitgeist at this time, but I don't feel, and I did a lot of reading and research and getting ready for this video, and I have in the past as well, to try to understand the timeline to see if I was just spuriously making this connection or if it was real. And I don't know if I'm ready to say that it was real and Claremont was aware of it, but it resonates that way for me because of the year that it's from in the 80s and because I know that this story was ongoing in the public consciousness in the 1980s. While the New Mutants are enjoying their shore leave, Professor X begins to dig in a little bit deeper into what is going on with this erstwhile comatose boy, David Haller. And it turns out that he is this autistic teen who has been driven into a catatonic state as a result of a terrorist attack on his home. He's Jewish. He's the son of Gabriel Haller, who is an ambassador from Israel and another former lover of Professor X. And a group of armed gunmen break into his home and try to kill him and his family and his godfather. They kill his godfather, but he survives, and he manifests his mutant power much too early and vaporizes his attackers. So how prescient is Claremont, right? Like, talk about a theme that is happening in this world right now. Anti-Semitism, gun violence, and terrorism. It's something that we're experiencing in the news as I record this on a daily basis. So again, this story, which is over 30 years old, resonates so strongly here. And David Haller has been relatively comatose since then, and Moira has been working with him. But not only has she not been able to break through, now he's putting people at risk in Muir Island. And so Professor X delves into his psyche and hits a wall. Now, we haven't seen Professor X come up against too many big psychic opponents at this point in the history of X-Men. I was trying to think if there's any point where he like really can't break through somebody's psychic defenses. We see a lot of like momentary like, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do it, and then he does, because that was the way that stories were written at that time. But I'm hard pressed to really think about a time that he's as stymied as consistently as he is here. Now, he's relatively weak in body too. He's walking right now, but that's a temporary fix, and he's about to take his leave from the X-Men franchise for many years and just a few issues after this story. But it's not just that he's feeling physically weak and a little bit off his game and his powers. He definitely is a little bit stumped about how to deal with David Haller. And so he's delving into his psyche and trying to kind of figure out what's happening there. And at one point gets stuck in kind of a feedback of psychic shock, which blasts across the room and pulls Xavier and the New Mutants, who are now back at Muir Island, and Mora and Gabriel Haller into Legion's psyche to kind of be stuck there in their astral selves. Before we talk about that, though, I want to talk about one more side plot theme in these very dense 3 issues. This theme is another one that's very present in conversation today. I did not know this when I picked these 3 issues. I'd never read them in full before. I'd only gone through them for some character moments. And this theme is one of informed consent. So, turns out Professor Xavier had been the doctor, the therapist of Gabriel Haller many years ago, and he at one point goes into her mind without her full permission to correct some problems that she's having, some past trauma. And he, as a result, doesn't feel that he manipulated her in any way. And they wind up becoming lovers. But there's always this specter hanging over their relationship that he knows everything about her. So there's a huge power differential, even if he hasn't planted a seed that maybe she could fall in love with him, even if he denies that, and even if he never did it. He knows everything about her, so wouldn't it be easy for him to position himself as the perfect partner for her and convince her to be in love with him? So she has to go through her whole life questioning if she was really in this relationship of her own free will. And we find out that that's actually a factor of why she has not disclosed to Professor Xavier, even when it becomes very crucial in the story, that David Haller is his son. Because for her, it's the one private piece of information that she has that he's never accessed before, which is really heavy for this New Mutants comic book. There's a second consent subplot. It's only in a few pages, but it has to do with Magneto and a character named Lee Forrester, who I cannot possibly hope to explain fully here, but she had been kind of on an adventure with Cyclops. She's marooned at the Bermuda Triangle. She's left there with Magneto. And this is a little bit after Magneto does the whole nuclear submarine thing we talked about in the last episode, back in X-Men 150. And so he's kind of a really bad guy at this point. And so they're uneasily living together in the Bermuda Triangle, and at one night he has this nightmare and he flies his bed out of the window over the sea with his magnetism powers, and he's about to kind of fall into the sea, and she leaps onto the bed and like shakes him awake and is able to save him. And in that heated moment, they fall into a passionate embrace and wind up sleeping with each other. She, the next day, is just doing her daily exercises, and Magneto comes kind of to try to make peace and talk to her. And she recoils from him for a really similar reason to Gabriel Haller, because of the power differential. She doesn't think that Magneto made her have sex with him, but she wonders if she ever really had a choice, and if she consciously understood that she had a choice, or if she subconsciously just surrendered to the moment because she knew she was up against the most powerful mutant on Earth, somebody who hates humans. He's an avowed, foe of humanity in many occasions. And Magneto says, no, this was a true moment between us. I've had this experience with a woman before with my original wife, Magda, and I would never repeat any kind of coercion. But Lee doesn't believe him. Not because she doesn't believe his words, but I don't think she believes that his good intent can resolve the power differential between the two of them, which is a really deep issue of consent that we are still exploring in the public conversation now today. And here it is in New Mutants in 1985. Now there's a third consent subplot, and it flips the other two a little bit on its head, which to me is why it's so interesting. This one involves Emma Frost, the White Queen, and one of her Hellion students at her Massachusetts Academy. His name is Empath. He's also a psychic, and he can project and control emotions. And in this tense confrontation between the two of them, he projects his emotions on Emma Frost, and it seems like like he's going to make her fall in love with him, which is, you know, even though Emma is a big, big villain at this point, we don't want to see that happen against her will, I don't think. But then, just as he thinks he's succeeded, she kind of reaches out her hand and grabs him by the throat, and she's like, did you think you could defeat me with your meager powers? And not only does she physically toss him aside, but she shuts off his mutant powers with her psychic powers, which is pretty big. And he's kind of just like thrown to the wayside and you know, left to kind of crawl away from the confrontation. So this is a really interesting moment because it seems like it's going to keep the male-female gender dynamic that we've had in the other two situations, but it actually winds up flipping it and having Emma Frost be the aggressor, although she was defending herself, and kind of keeping up the idea of these older mutants that have so much power and how you can never entirely have your behavior, your power, your agency be under your own control. Even if this Emma example is a positive one because she defended herself and the kid was being a slime ball, it still carries that theme across the books, which I think is very interesting. Now we get to talk a little bit more about the Legion plot, about delving into his brain, but to talk about that plot, I think we have to talk a little bit about Bill Sienkiewicz. He is a very famous comic artist for many things, including Elektra Assassin, but many, many other works over the years. And one of the things he's very famous for is this particular run of New Mutants with Chris Claremont. Now, if you were used to the very kind of pretty Paul Smith art that had been on Uncanny X-Men before this, or even John Romita Jr., who was certainly more lined, but still like a very traditional Silver Age influenced comic book artist, Sienkiewicz is a shock to the system. His characters are jagged. He likes to use Kirby-influenced collaging, where sometimes he has photographic elements or elements of other media mixed into the background. It could be jarring, and I try to put myself in the mind space of like a teenager reading this at the time. Was it so cool because it was like so weird and different and transgressive, or were you kind of like, oh, this is ugly? I don't know how. I think I would have thought it was ugly even when I was a teenager reading the X-Men, but today I really appreciate how much it makes my eye linger on the art. It's not easy to digest. It's not hard to figure out, but it's just got like a certain kind of psychedelic and occasionally like cubist quality to it that you really need to take some time to interpret. And it's a perfect match for the kind of like horrific vibe that New Mutants has at this point. And in this case, as we descend into the astral plane in Legion's mind. Now, this is a mindscape that is partially based on Paris, but partially has slices of other cities plugged into it. And we find that that's because Legion has absorbed this personality of one of the terrorists who he disintegrated. And so that man's memory, who is mostly just known as the Arab here, is kind of shuffled into Legion's. And so Professor Xavier and all of the other characters are trying to make their way to this like central dome that contains Legion's core personality, and his entire psychic self seems to be fighting against them. And it seems like that's being conducted by this dead terrorist psyche, the Arab, that's haunting his brain. And along the way, Professor Xavier and the New Mutants meet two other manifestations of Legion's psyche, although we don't really understand fully what they are at first. And as they start to use their powers and talk with the team more, we understand these are his other personalities. It's a man, Jack Wayne, who's this very kind of like doodly save-the-day character, and then this younger woman who very much feels like a little bit of a template for Boom Boom. So the team is trying to climb up this hill to get to the psychic bubble with these two characters, and everybody's kind of being beset from all sides and wounded and blasted, and Xavier's like at his wit's end, and they have to really trust these personality manifestations. But both Wolfsbane and Mirage feel like there's something the manifestations are not telling them, especially Jack Wayne. And when they get into the bubble, it turns out that the Arab is not the evil terrorist they thought he was anymore. He was when he committed that act, but he's had years to be trapped inside of Legion's brain, and he's kind of got a positive kind of Stockholm syndrome now, where he feels that it's his duty to help Legion get reassembled psychically, even though his own personality has been shattered and shuffled with the Arab's personality and also the personality of these other characters that he's created in his mind, each with a distinct psychic power. And so ultimately the team like reaches a deal almost with the other personalities that they're going to work with the Arab and put Legion back together, like proverbial psychic Humpty Dumpty, to try to give him some semblance of a real personality so he can live in the real world. But we learn at the very end that this has not gone quite as we had hoped, because all of the other personalities, including the Arab, are still manifesting themselves, but now they're manifesting themselves not through blasts of power only, but through speaking, through Legion's mouth, through his voice. And in a relatively disturbing scene, Professor X comes to him as a father to greet him and meet him for the first time, and he's spoken back to by these other personalities. It's really kind of unnerving in this horror movie kind of way. Now, this is just the beginning of Legion's journey that will continue, as I said, through that Shadow King Rising book, if you pick it up, to follow through to a brief arc where he's still on Muir Island in Uncanny X-Men, and then ultimately to the Muir Island saga, where he is a big part of the larger machinations that are happening there. So if you really want to figure out who Legion was in the comic book, you really should pick up that book, because it's got like a perfect reading order for him in terms of his appearances back in the 80s. I have to say, I really did not know what I was getting us into when I picked these for this week. I have read early New Mutants, I think up to like issue 10, 11, or 12, and then I've read later New Mutants. But this particular period of New Mutants is like Claremont at the height of his prose powers. And I have to say, the prose in this issue was fantastic. It didn't feel kind of belabored and repetitive that a later stage Chris Claremont could occasionally be. And it didn't even do that kind of like over-introducing of the characters over and over again, which I think is also a Claremont hallmark. It's just like really delightful, but I had to take breaks. Like every few pages I wanted to go and do some different thing, because to read prose that is that thick and then also to be looking at Bill Sienkiewicz's art it's really a challenge. It's a definite challenge, which was enjoyable, and these issues are good, but it's not easy reading, especially if you've been recently weaned on modern comic books and their decompression. That's it for my discussion of New Mutants 1983, 26 through 28, but I'm now ready for your discussion in the comments below. Did you read this? If you did, was it your first time or had you read it before? And how did your perception differ this time around from when you originally read it? Whenever you originally read it, whether you read it as it was on the newsstands in the 1980s or at some point prior to just now, did you pick up some of these themes originally about consent, about other allegories to what was happening in the world, or are these much more present for you now in your current read? And I really want to know, did you feel sympathetic to Legion? You know, I think that his autism is something that we see much more in the world around us now and is much more spoken about. And at the time, it wasn't as much. And I think it's easier if you know kids and adults that are not just neurotypical, that are on an autistic spectrum. Now it's much easier to look at Legion and have a lot more sympathy for him. When at the time, I think the combination of his autism and his schizophrenia was played in this very like horror movie, you know, a movie of the week kind of way, where he's supposed to just be bad and scary. And it's hard to see him like that now. And I'm interested to know if that's just me or if you felt like that too in your modern read. Plus, what other things did you notice about it? There are a lot of interesting little details here that I just did not delve into. This is not meant to be a perfectly encyclopedic addressing of these issues. And so if you noticed other interesting things, I'd love to talk to you about them below. Next week, we are making a major leap from this 1980s material. We're advancing all the way to 2008 to read a mini-series called X-Men Worlds Apart that focuses on Storm as she is torn between the world of the X-Men, newly in San Francisco, and the world of Wakanda, where she had been the queen and the partner to T'Challa the Black Panther. This was a series I really enjoyed the first time around, but I was like totally unknowing of what was going on in the X-Men franchise and then the Black Panther franchise at the time. Now I know so much more. It's been, you know, over half a decade since I read it, and we're all, many of us, hot off of watching the Black Panther movie, so I think we're going to see very different things in it this time around compared to what we saw originally. I want to thank you so much for pulling out your back issues or getting online and reading them digitally to do this epic X-Men reread with me. If you're enjoying this reread, if you're not enjoying this reread, I really want to hear from you below. This is a pilot. There's no guarantee that I'm going to do more than 7 weeks of it, but there's a guarantee that I've got 50 years of X-Men comic books in this house with me. And so we could be doing this for hundreds and hundreds of episodes if you show support. So please, comments, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please subscribe to see regular comics content all the time. And thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the X-Men Epic Reread, or Epic X-Men Reread rather, from Crushing Comics.